From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
President Biden officially unveils his Supreme Court reform, a radical assault on judicial independence. What's in it? Why now? The motivation? And why aren't Republicans making a bigger deal of this? Welcome. I'm Kim Strassel from the Wall Street Journal opinion pages. This is Potomac Watch, and I am joined today by my fabulous colleagues, Kate Batchelder-Odell and Alicia Finley. Well, he did it. Even as Joe Biden bows out of running again for re-election, he has proposed one of, I have to say, in all my time in politics, one of the most destructive plans for asserting presidential control over a rival branch of government since possibly Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his court packing scheme some 90 years ago. The plan, which he described in an op-ed in the Washington Post, is somewhat along the lines of what had been expected. Let's listen to Joe Biden talk about what he's proposing and why. And first, we'll hear a clip of him arguing for term limits for the Supreme Court.
We've had term limits for presidents of the United States for nearly 75 years after the Truman administration. And I believe we should have term limits for Supreme Court justices of the United States as well. In fact, the United States is the only major constitutional democracy that gives lifetime seats in their high court. Term limits would help ensure that the court membership changes with some regularity. That would make timing for the court's nomination more predictable and less arbitrary. Reduce the chance that any single presidency imposes undue influence in generations to come.
And now let's listen to the president talk about the need for a binding ethics reform on the court.
Supreme Court's current ethics code is weak and even more frightening, voluntary. Any code of Congress must be enforceable. Under the reform I propose, justice would be required to disclose gifts, refrain from public political activity, recuse themselves in cases in which they or their spouses have a financial or other conflict of interest. Most people don't realize that Congress passed a law decades ago that says all federal judges, including Supreme Court justices, have to recuse themselves in such cases. But the current justices insist on enforcing that requirement themselves without any public oversight or compulsion.
Alicia, we went through some of these proposals last Friday, and we're going to focus a little bit more here on some of the motivations and politics. But just to review for everyone who's listening here, what exactly is Biden proposing?
So first of all, as he mentioned, he's proposing term limits, 18 years for the Supreme Court. Right now, if you recall, that they have life tenure, and that was intentional by the Constitution's framers because they wanted judicial independence. So there would be term limits, and after 18 years, justices would be put out to pasture, so to speak. Lower court judges can take senior status after or when they don't want to completely retire and fully sign off, and they can still hear some cases. Here, this would essentially force the Supreme Court justices to take this kind of senior status, and that's how it gets around the constitutional life tenure requirement. In addition, it would impose some kind of ethics rules on the justices, and these would be to some extent binding. So lower court judges would review ethics complaints or investigate these ethics complaints that would be allowed to be made by third parties, and then issue some kind of recommendation, and then the justice's own peers would then vote on this. And I can't think of any worse idea about how to ensure a Supreme Court comity than this. And those are really the heart of his proposal. He also has proposed a constitutional amendment to overturn the Supreme Court's U.S. v. Trump a decision that provides presidential immunity for his core constitutional duties, which I think the president misinterpreted or has intentionally so perhaps, or just is misleading the public about, because it does not provide absolute immunity just within his core constitutional duties.
Just a quick follow-up on this. Presumably this outside group of judges that got to decide on Supreme Court behavior could also require those justices, when in certain circumstances, to recuse themselves from certain cases. Would it be binding in that regard?
The lower judges would not be able to rule or require, but the Supreme Court justices' own colleagues could.
Wow. Okay. This is just remarkable. Something that triggers me as I was listening to the president there, and even though most of the press is glossing over this, can we just meditate for a minute on the notion of a man who has spent 50 years in elected office, who literally has done nothing in his life beyond work in Washington, D.C., suggest term limits on another branch of government? Moreover, the way he just kind of glosses over here the major constitutional democratic issues involved in this, which I think you just touched on some, Alicia. But Kate, I want to ask a question. I want to try to put this in perspective. You listen to the president there. He presents all of this. It's very reasonable. He talks about the term limits, for instance. We'll have more predictability, less arbitrariness, talk about these high standards that would come from an ethics regime. But let's actually walk through what it would look like here. I mean, the gulf between what he presents so happily in his explanation and then the reality of having a president via Congress suddenly reorder an institution that is a vital aspect of checks and balances, rewrite its role in a way that essentially makes it subservient to outside forces, as it were, or lower court justices and to presidential politics. Because I think this is something people are missing here. The pitch by Democrats is we're going to make the court better. My view is that's not what's going to happen. So maybe walk us through what the court would look like under a regime like this, one in which you could have outside complaints adjudicated by a group of judges, one in which every election is now about which two justices are getting forced into senior status and which two new ones are coming on. The confirmation process, what's this going to look like?
Well, Kim, I think you're nicely driving home that anyone who thinks our politics is too nonpartisan or tranquil, this is the perfect proposal for you. And I think to your point, your meditation on the larger picture, it is breathtaking that the president is basically being dragged off the stage by his own party and on the way out, warning us all about loss of institutions after telling the public for months he was fit to run for president. But anyway, on the practical points of how this would look, I would point to a couple of tangible examples of the recusal demands and how easily those can get out of hand. Even on the lower courts now, you have left-wing interest groups that are making all sorts of demands for judges to recuse themselves based on really tenuous connections they may have to the case. One example of that, Don Willett on the Fifth Circuit, he heard a case about the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and was petitioned to recuse himself because one of his children's college savings accounts that millions of Americans have held $2,000 of stock in Citigroup, which was not a party to the case. So these kinds of demanding even the most minor tangential aspects of the judge's portfolio. Judges could, I guess he can only hold cash under his mattress. You would have all sorts of second guessing like that. Just in any time, any party could come up with something and think that they might get an unfavorable ruling. The term limits idea is an especially noxious idea. And to add to what you had to say about it, the constitutional scholar Adam White, I thought, made some good points in a piece on Monday that one thing that hasn't got enough attention is you would encroach upon the Senate's power to advise and consent on Supreme Court picks. So in addition to diluting the Supreme Court's own constitutional authority, you would basically force the Senate to confirm two nominees each presidential election, which, as Mitch McConnell showed in 2016, he took a political gamble and decided to wait on a nominee, and that was the Senate's prerogative. So you also would have one other quick example I'd give that I just don't think people are thinking about what kind of can of worms we'd be opening here is, can you imagine if suddenly we had Supreme Court justices who had long employment tenures after their time sitting on the court? One of the things that the public hates about Congress is, you serve for a few years and then you go lobby or whatever. Are we going to have white shoe law firms having former Supreme Court justices of counsel? I mean, I think that would be a terrible system that nobody wants. So again, I really think this is, to call it half-baked would be too generous on all of the practical fallout that will just diminish the public's faith in judicial independence and the court's nonpartisanship.
Yeah, I hadn't even got there. Revolving door Supreme Court justices appearing in front of the chamber they used to sit in front of. That's a fun thought. Okay, we're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk about what's really going on here, the raw politics behind this, when we come back. Welcome back. I'm Kim Strassel here with the Potomac Watch podcast and with Alicia Finley and Kate Batchelder Odell talking about President Biden's now concrete proposals for Supreme Court, quote, reform. Alicia, let's just be blunt about this. Why now? And this is a question that continues to prey on my mind. We've had this campaign that's really just ramped up in the last few years, in particular against the supposed ethical violations of guys like Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito, who decades ago went on a fishing trip here or there, and supposedly this now disqualifies them for the court. If you think about it, Clarence Thomas has been on the court for 30 years. Sam Alito has been on the court for going on 20. And indeed, a lot of those supposed ethics issues were things that happened long ago that were easily discoverable. But only now we are having this hue and cry for why suddenly the court is at a place where it must be changed. Why not 10 years ago? Why is this happening now? And of course, the point is, it's not the court has changed. It's rather the Democratic Party and their sour grapes over the current constitution of the court. Do you disagree, or why are we having this happen now?
I agree. I think that there are a few other points. One, Democrats are trying to rally their base around this, saying that if you vote for Harris in this election and a Democratic senator, we can actually change the court. In part because the court actually is becoming more influential and Congress hasn't really been doing a job on a lot of things. So the court's decisions are affecting more, especially administrative state actions. You've seen that with it overturning Chevron deference doctrine, but has also ruled against Biden on a number of things, his student loan forgiveness. It rejected the Obama Clean Power Plan and put some limits on what the EPA can do, in addition to the Clean Water Act. And so this is in part intended to galvanize the progressive base. It's also notable that, as you said, the conservatives on the court, including the Chief Justice, 3 of them have now served past the 18-year term limit. And so the next president would presumably be able to, if a Democrat would presumably be able to replace them with more liberal judges. I'm not sure this is actually very smart politics. I don't know why the Democrats are walking and wading into this, because what they're really proposing is quite radical. And if Republicans decide to make an issue of it, I think they could turn the tables on Kamala and Biden and say, you guys are trying to basically pack the court by other means, which is what they are trying to do. And recall that these kind of proposals were floated actually even before the 2020 election in the primary. And I think Biden actually tried to kind of equivocate on this because he realized that it wouldn't play well in the general electorate. That this kind of proposal to pack the court or restructure it is not popular among independents.
Yeah, I want to drill in on that because I think this is a really important point about the fact that it's now Biden proposing this. And if you look back and remember how all this rolled, you go back 4 or 5 years ago, it was a position among some on the more radical left. It was viewed then as pretty outrageous and a little fringy. It very rapidly became the standard policy position of most of the Democrats that were running in the 2020 primary. And notably, Biden did not join that crew. And there were a lot of people who would argue that that was part of what ended up helping him in the end, that South Carolina victory, these more moderate and independent voters who didn't like this lurch to the left and came out and ended up handing him his primary victory. But Kate, what we have now is the president of the United States, who I would also note held out for most of the 4 years he was in office, despite pressure from his party to adopt these positions. He refused to go there. But now he's adopting it too. So what we have is an entire Democratic Party from the top to the bottom that is saying this is where it needs to go. How does that change the political landscape going forward and make this more of a threat, with the president himself throwing all of his weight into this issue?
I think our editorial described this assault as a threat to democracy, and I don't think that was necessarily overstated. There's a congealing narrative out there that, well, okay, Congress would never pass this, and it's just Joe Biden throwing it out the door on the way out, and it's not a realistic possibility. I think that is not necessarily the right analysis, because to your point about just how quickly the window of acceptable policy on the left is moving, it is very much a possibility that the next time Democrats take power, they do something like this. The Democrats have also been willing to break the filibuster in the Senate that requires 60 votes. So they have shown some ruthlessness and willingness to pass their agenda. I also think, another example of just how rapidly the party has moved left that I always go back to is in the Democratic primaries, in addition to Joe Biden not being interested in court packing, he also supported a public option for Medicare when some of his competition, like Kamala, wanted to go straight to a European single-payer health system. And the irony of that is that the Joe Biden position in the debates over Obamacare, that was the radical progressive position. And then by 2020, the public option was the compromise on the way to single payer, which was then the more radical left-wing option on how to deal with the healthcare problem. So I make that point to illustrate that you do have a window here that is moving rapidly, that what was the moderate position in 2020 has already become the standard bearer now in 2024. So I think you have to take the threat to the constitutional order that this plan represents quite seriously and not just as a politically remote possibility.
Yeah, especially because we need to couple that with the growing Democratic demand that should they manage to, in particular, increase their majority in the Senate, that they want to get rid of the filibuster, which in theory might make some of this legislation more easy to pass if they tried to go that route. Again, that's separate from the constitutional questions and whether or not you don't need amendments for it. But it certainly makes the immediate political danger of it more real and immediate.